The Policy Management Committee reviewed draft amendments to policy JGA, the student discipline, back on February 18th and again on October 21st of this year. The draft policy amendment that the committee is proposing is meant to accomplish a few things, which we'll let staff talk to more about, but briefly, it, number one, brings the policy in alignment with Maryland's statutory and regulatory required elements, as well as board actions on policy ACA, which is the non-discrimination, equity, and cultural proficiency that we voted on June 29th of 2021. And number two, to provide a philosophy of behavior intervention that is rehabilitative, restorative, educational, and implemented fairly and equitably with clear, appropriate, and consistent expectations and consequences to address student behavior in violation of the Student Code of Conduct in MCPS, regardless of whether the instructional environment is in person or virtual. So I will turn it over to staff, and then once tentative action is taken, we can send it out for public policy or public comment. Go ahead.
Thank you, Ms. Smondrowski. Staff from the Office of Teaching, Learning, and Schools joins us at the table to present on this policy. Thank you for highlighting that the recent changes to Maryland law require the MCPS to update our policy to provide for restorative approaches to discipline. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Shauna K. Jarambi.
Good evening, President Wolf, Policy Chairperson Smondrowski, members of the Board of Education, and Superintendent McKnight. Today, we're here to talk to you about why change in policy is not just important, but necessary. So, as my colleagues and General Counsel just explained, House Bill 725 requires language in Maryland school discipline policies to be updated to include restorative practices. But the true importance of a change in that policy is not just what the law requires, it is what our core values demand. And if we can move to the next slide, please. And the next. And the next. One more. All right, so our core values say it the best. First and foremost, they ground our work with students and families. And so once again, true alignment requires us to match our beliefs with our words and our actions. And when we talk about restorative practices, we talk about some of those things that we have highlighted there in bold. Under respect, we talk about fair treatment, honesty, openness, and integrity. We talk about understanding that personal growth, including student growth, because behaviors can change, students can get better, inspire all of us towards excellence. We really speak to equity, that each and every student matters, and that outcomes should not be predicted by race. And when we talk about discipline, when we talk about suspensions, when we talk about disproportionality, we see that those things are not always in alignment. And finally, we talk about eliminating instructional or institutional barriers to student success. So changing the policy, while it is something that is required, it's more than the law demands, it's what our core values demand. Next slide, please. I wanted us to take a moment to take a look at the word discipline, the definition itself. Talking about the practice of training people to obey rules and punishing disobedience. I think this definition is incomplete. It doesn't speak to all that we do for students. We don't just train students and correct disobedience. Instead, what MCPS does, what we try to do through our practices of trauma-informed learning, through the practices of restorative approaches, is we try to ask, what is the root of the behavior, right? We know that if that behavior is not addressed, it's exhibited again. And many people at this board in front of me have worked on different projects involving student data, particularly around exclusionary practices. And one of the things that you know is that some of the same students that are excluded again and again and again. And that's because we don't address the root. We also talk about who else is harmed or experience trauma due to the behavior. So not just a focus on those that commit the behavior, but those that experience it, those that see it, those that are around it. All these parts need to be addressed, not just correcting the disobedience of the person that disobeyed, right? So we really want to focus on accountability in the most accountable way. Is there a way back for students once harm has been done? Is there a way to repair relationships and restore? And at the same time, who else can learn from this so that this is not something that happens again? Next slide, please. So first I want to start again with, because this language will appear in the policy, what is restorative justice? And I know that there are many definitions that have been floated about, especially recently, that can kind of muddy the waters. So I think it's important to clarify. In MCPS, restorative justice is an approach to building community. You will often hear us talk about the pillars of identity, of community, of vision, right? It's a way for students to engage in self-care, in conflict resolution. It's a platform that allows students to actively engage in problem solving in every lens. It allows them to truly take responsibility for their actions and to work with those affected to restore and to repair the members of the community that were harmed as a result of those same actions. It focuses on relationships, responsibility, and most importantly, true accountability. Next slide, please. Before my other colleagues share some of those real and tangible examples of how restorative practices and approaches are applied throughout our school system, I wanted to share something that restorative justice is not. Often when people hear the word restorative justice, restorative practices, restorative approaches, there's an instant feeling of a lack of accountability, that there are no consequences. And I wanted to share clearly with the board today that restorative justice does not negate consequences, right? Instead, we advocate for accountable and appropriate consequences that address the root of the harm. So I'm going to read this again. This was presented at the February 2020 board meeting, as well as more recently in October. So restorative justice does not negate the need for disciplinary consequences. Rather, they enable students to examine their attitudes and behaviors in a supportive environment while working to repair the harm in a way that is meaningful to those who were affected. Next slide, please. Okay, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Moran.
Thank you, Ms. Dorn. Good evening, Dr. McKnight, members of the Board of Education. Good to be with you guys this evening. As a district, we are taking a strategic approach to connecting a number of teams across central office to continuously evaluate student behavioral data to identify disparities in that data, including suspension data and inform changes that will address those disparities. A grounding thread throughout this cross-office partnership is a commitment to using restorative practices throughout our interactions with students, staff, and families from the outset of addressing behavioral issues, and not as a different or added component of our work. We believe a focus on restoration and repair after harm is done is fundamental approach to supporting strong student behavioral health. Next slide, please. As an example of how schools apply restorative approaches to address a student behavioral issue, let's take the example of a student sending a message to her English teacher making threats of violence to the school community. At first look, this action falls into the disruptive behavior category of false alarm, which ranges on the disciplinary response matrix between level 2, teacher-initiated administrative supported responses, to level 4, short-term out-of-school exclusionary responses. School teams could also go beyond the recommended range in the Code of Conduct to a level 5 response, long-term out-of-school exclusionary practices, if they determine the level of threat warrants that disciplinary response. Next slide, please. This purely disciplinary approach would have the school administration recommending the student receive a level 5 response, which is an out-of-school exclusionary practice, which in this case would be a 10-day suspension with a recommendation for expulsion. Without digging into the context of the situation, determining more about why it happened, and determining how to repair the harm, student threats to the community have historically often gone straight to a 10-day suspension and recommendation for expulsion. Now let's consider how this scenario looks as we use a restorative approach. In using the restorative approach, we still maintain a focus on school safety. The first step in addressing this behavior is for the school to contact our police partners to help investigate the credibility of the threat. In these cases, our police partners or other agency partners will immediately do a home visit to assess the well-being of the student and determine if the threat is credible. Let's say in this case, the visit to the student's home revealed that the threat was not credible. The school team then initiated a student behavioral threat assessment and finds that the student is low risk. The behavioral threat assessment involves administration, counseling, security, and central office partners in the Office of Family and Student Support and Engagement to determine the context of the student's current behavior and needs. This low-risk determination means that the school team will start taking actions to fact-find on the student's needs and supports that can be put in place to address the reasons why she wrote the letter. You can see on the sequence of actions on the slide that the student received a 4-day out-of-school suspension because the action was disruptive to the safety of the school, but there are also many other steps that need to happen to evaluate what actions the school team will take to support the student's anxiety and social-emotional health. After the student returned from her suspension, the school restorative justice coach met with her and they determined that a meaningful apology to the teacher and a restorative conversation with the teacher would happen. The student and teacher are able to repair their relationship, and the RJ coach considers how to take the learning from this scenario school-wide with a mindfulness lesson and sharing resources for supporting students with anxiety and friendships. In short, the discipline or consequences is not teaching. Adding the restorative justice component applies teaching to those consequences. I believe now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Mr. Neff.
Good evening, Dr. McKnight, and members of the Board of Education. My name is Steve Neff, Director of Pupil Personnel and Attendance Services. I'm happy to be with you this afternoon. Ms. Rubin has a vision of one OTLS and cross-office support to schools, and that vision is a staple of our daily work. And this particular topic is an excellent example of why it is so important. We can only effectively address issues related to school climate, student behavior, especially the disproportionality in our student discipline, if we engage more than one office and if we implement more than one intervention or strategy. So all of the offices in OTLS must be actively involved. And as you've been made aware, the Office of Student and Family Support and Engagement is actively involved in these efforts. Nearly 11,000 staff members have received professional learning in the foundations of restorative justice. About 1,500 staff members have been trained to teach mindfulness strategies in school settings. We are implementing the Leader in Me social-emotional learning curriculum in a third of our schools this school year, with the rest of the school system implementing the curriculum within the next 2 years. We continue to reach out to many community partners to increase the mental health supports available to our students and families, both inside of our schools and in our community. We also partner with our colleagues in the appeals transfer team. They handle the most intensive disciplinary situations to ensure that restorative practices are considered before an event, during the disciplinary process, and after the disciplinary dispensation. We can't do any of this work without our school support and improvement director colleagues who supervise and coach their schools as they analyze their school-specific discipline data. We also actively collaborate with our colleagues in the special education department, so I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Mr. Lynch, to talk a little bit more about our collaborative efforts.
Good evening, board members. My name is Philip Lynch. I'm the Director of Special Education in the Office of Special Education and the Office of Teaching and Learning. As Mr. Neff mentioned, this is a collaborative effort, and we also take many different approaches. One way that the Office of Special Education has worked to create change through practice is by proactively supporting students with behavior and self-regulation needs through the use of curriculum resources such as zones of regulation, which is designed to teach students about how to be more mindful about their emotions and how to apply specific strategies to their emotions when they feel as though those strategies need to be applied. As Dr. Moran mentioned, this is a process of teaching students about being more aware of their emotions, and these strategies are currently in place at our schools that host and support students with social emotional special education needs. In 2011, we began the process of training staff members on de-escalation strategies through the use of specific training practices. We have trained to date roughly 4,500, or since 2019, 4,500 staff members on these strategies. In addition, we've added an online module that focuses on de-escalation strategies that we are disseminating widely to schools as another resource. We've also, with the support of the Board of Education, added social workers to our interdisciplinary teams at 25 of our schools. These interdisciplinary teams make up a group of professionals that support our students in our schools that provide support and services to students with social emotional needs. And that would include the social worker, the school psychologist, a behavior support teacher, or a resource teacher that is focused on addressing the needs of those students. And these teams are not just a support to special education students, they're designed to be a support and resource to the entire school through professional development and also through crisis management as schools work through this process that we're describing here today. Thank you.
Please advance to the next slide, please. And one more. Thank you. So today we shared with you a little bit about changes that we've made through our processes, working cross office, our practices that we have in place, and today we are asking for you to support us in change with policy. The language is very important to me. I shared this last time. As a former ESOL teacher, I think it is very important to say exactly what it is that we mean. A lot can be lost in communication. And I think even something as small as the word discipline policy doesn't convey everything that we want it to, and considering our environment doesn't convey everything that we need it to. I've listened to a lot of the board meeting today and heard a lot of reinforcement about the need for mental health supports, the need to focus on trauma-informed practices, and I really think that discipline doesn't say all of those things, right? So I am advocating today with all of our colleagues here to support the policy changing the language from a school discipline policy to a behavior intervention, safety, and well-being plan that more clearly addresses what it is that we do and more clearly aligns with our core values. Thank you.
Are you,
Thank you, Mr. Ramby. Thank you, Mr. Lynch, Mr. Neff, Dr. Moran. We're prepared to provide a high-level overview of the state-required changes and the follow-ups from the last meeting, unless you'd like to proceed with discussion.
well, I was just going to say what I can do is, as the committee chair, I'll move approval. I'll read the two resolves. It doesn't need a second, and then I'll allow my colleagues to offer some thoughts, comments, and if there needs to be, then you can go through areas of concern and question. Does that work?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so then I will read the two resolves. There is resolved that the Board of Education take tentative action on draft board policy JGA, student discipline, and be it further resolved that the draft board policy JGA, student discipline, be sent out for public comment. I do have one question about the resolves, and that is, aren't we changing the name? No, we're leaving it the same. For some reason, I thought we had changed the title.
So it's not changing.
Behavior, intervention, safety, and well-being.
Are you referring that the resolve doesn't change the name? Okay.
That is our customary practice, that until you take final action
Okay.
to change the name of a policy, all working documents will refer to it by its existing name.
Okay.
It does feel like, wait.
Well, I was like, wait, I thought that was like kind of a big thing.
It
So,
is-
okay, I just wanted to clarify.
Deliberate.
Okay. So if any of my colleagues have any questions, comments, discussion, I open the floor.
Oh, I just have a small one. On the slide that has discipline defined, and at the bottom, it's number 4, it says, who else can learn from this? And I think the aiders and the betters can learn from this. I guess that's built in, but I think it's important to include them because they kind of push kids to do things that they shouldn't do.
Ms. Mandrowski. Oh, I'm sorry, Rebecca.
Excellent point. Ms. Harris? Did you-
Thank you. Yeah. Sorry. I think many of us over the years have heard varying levels of uncertainty and confusion from our school communities about what restorative justice means, what restorative practices are. And so when I'm looking here, I'm just going to ask, I think, some of the most common terms here that people might not understand, and give you all the opportunity just on the record to give kind of a clear explanation to our communities about what these terms mean. And the first one would be conducting a behavior threat assessment. Now, what does that mean?
I'm happy to answer that, but I'm sure many of my colleagues on here, we've all been a part of that, would be happy to chime in too. So behavior threat assessment is, it is a nationally normed process that talks about whenever a possible threat might be in place. There's a flow map that indicates with us questions to ask and where we should go. In identifying, is the threat imminent, and that will determine what our protocol is next. Going through, a BTAT requires at least 3 members of the school team or central office team, including a mental health provider, that will ask those questions to determine whether that threat is a low-risk threat or a high-level threat. And the way that we proceed forward depends on how that threat is gauged. That doesn't just include a conversation, right? That includes a review of the student's history, a review of prior incidents, a review of the cumulative file, a review of the student's current state, to determine how high level or low, high, moderate, or low level that threat is, whether that student is high risk or low risk.
So if I'm the student, what will I experience if I am the one on whom a behavior threat assessment is being conducted, I guess would be the word?
I think it depends on the circumstance, right? There are times where that BTAT will happen without necessarily the input of the student, but review of some of the student's online activity. It could include things that the student has written or stated. Sometimes it is appropriate that the conversations with that student has occurred, if it's possible, right? Sometimes that student may not be, they may be not on site or not available or reluctant to speak. So it really just depends. But there are conversations that occur with that student when the BTAT is occurring.
And what will the parent or guardian know, and when will they know it if their student is involved?
Sure. So usually, by the time we have to call together a behavior threat assessment team, the parent is already informed that the student has made a threat of violence, or any threat, as a matter of fact. It doesn't have to be of violence. And so usually they're involved in the process. I can speak to, and this is not my expertise, I'm mostly a participant, but I can speak to the most recent BTAT that I was in. The parent and me, as well as the principal and the student, met beforehand, and we were able to get their perspectives and their voice about the circumstance and what happened and their rationale and reasoning. And so then I was able to share that with the BTAT team when it was conducted.
Thank you. And for people in our community who don't know what a restorative justice coach is and where they're located throughout our system,
Absolutely. So this is a very fair question, and one that our student member of the board, Ms. Oluni, asked on our last meeting. So a restorative justice coach is a newer position. It was implemented this school year after July 1st. Each secondary school has a restorative justice coach. It's a stipended position providing 240 hours where that coach can serve as a resource to the school. So I'll tell you about the asks that they're working on this quarter. So for right now, they're working on 4 asks. The first is to engage the community. So they're holding parent meetings, sending out newsletters, engaging our parents in conversations about what RJ is. The second ask of them for this quarter is that they're engaging their student communities. So schools are in different places with their RJ work. Some have student RJ boards that have long been in place, like Churchill, and there are others that are just getting their communities acclimated to the practices that we have in place. So they're engaging their students. The third thing that they're doing is they're working with their school leadership teams. So part of that 240-hour stipend is to be a part of the instructional leadership team. So they're reviewing the discipline data. Some are participating in decisions, not all, and some are facilitating during or after an event. So they might be leading the circles, they might be recommending next steps and actions. And so there are 66 stipended positions, one for each of our secondary schools. However, some schools split the allocation. So it's a decent sized stipend, so some schools have it split between 2 people. And that's a PLC that is up and running. In fact, they just met on November 30th. As far as how to know your coach, through the tasks that they do, including engaging the parent community and the student community, we should know who they are. MCC PTA has also requested a list of all the coaches for our secondary schools. And because I know it might come up, elementary schools. Elementary schools do not have restorative justice coaches, something that we're working on, but they do have restorative justice or mindfulness team leaders, which is, it's not the same stipend, it's only about $300 to help to begin some of that work. But our central office RJ specialists also support all of our schools as well.
Thank you. And I would just ask, I think all of this is very helpful, what you all are telling us in this as well. And I don't know if there's a way to do this because technology is not my thing, but when we put this policy draft out for comment, is it possible to link this document and maybe even this clip, this time-stamped clip from today's meeting, so that people, when they read the policy, can get some more background and information? Because I think this really illustrates where the draft is going. I think it's very, very helpful.
I love that idea. I think that's a very good idea. I think it can also include a link to the policy committee meeting where they originally went through a lot of this, and we had several of these discussions. Ms. O'Looney?
Yeah, so I was able to ask most of my questions during the policy management committee meeting we had. I did just want to highlight the comments of a student who came to testify earlier today. His name was Mr. McNeely, and he was concerned about a student who was, I believe, a behavioral threat assessment had been conducted, but they were still allowed to be around some of their classmates. So I was wondering what the restorative justice approach says for victims of violence or victims of sexual assault. What does it do and say for them?
So Ms. Olney, I can't speak to you about the legal component of that, right? Because Ian is referring to something very specific, and I'll turn that over to my colleagues who know a little bit better about that. But one thing that I can say is I am so proud to see Ian here today. I say that honestly because we, the Restorative Justice Unit, did a student forum in consultation with Northwest High School, where Ian is a student. And he was very passionate. I was able to get his information, and we talked about what were appropriate ways to advocate. And seeing him here today speaks to that some of the approaches that we talk about in restorative justice does work. He stood before you today and shared his truth and advocated for change. And that's something that I'm very proud that we have supported. In fact, I sent him an email afterwards saying that I was so very proud of him. And I did not expect him here today. So I just wanted to share with you that while I can't talk about the legal aspects of when there has been an allegation that is not school-related, I don't know all the laws around that, but I can tell you the support aspect that we're talking about in this policy, I got to see it authentically in place today, unexpectedly on the day that we're having this conversation, so it speaks volumes.
Does that answer your question?
Not really, but I appreciate the response. Thank you, and shout out to Ian for his time. Thank you.
So I'm just wondering if I might respond to Ms. Oluni really quickly. I think part of what I heard in your question was an interest in understanding what happens to the victim as far as restorative justice is concerned. And especially it's tricky when we're dealing with something along the lines of sexual assault, right? So there are legal implications for that. But one of the things about restorative justice is, I think what you heard Ms. Shauna Kay say earlier is the importance of those who witness, those who are allies, and how do they get empowered. And I think the example, that the connection she's making is he witnessed it, so he experienced it. He's an ally, and there was a way to channel that energy into a productive side. For the actual victim, there is, especially with bullying, sexual harassment, those are sensitive issues that we want to coach the victims around whether or not they want to participate in a restorative practice, either after all of the legal components are completed, how they would like to see the restoration happen. And then that involves the psychologist, the counselor, those mental health providers, because those are significant issues. But the opportunity is there, and we have had instances and situations where victims have felt compelled and they felt restored and empowered because they had the opportunity to voice and speak out about the impact of the incident on them. But that is by their own design, so we don't mandate that.
I appreciate that response. I remember seeing something about that community building aspect, but the fact that it's optional for that student is really good to hear. Thank you.
Yeah, I too really appreciate you jumping in there with that explanation. I know that there's a lot of concern frequently about whether or not the victim is going to have to make more changes than the, accused, if you want. So that is something that continually comes up, especially among our students, in terms of making sure that we're not ignoring the fact that there's a victim. So, Ms. Silvestri?
Thank you. In reviewing the policy, I thought it was very well written and straightforward, and I appreciated the changes that you all made. I was looking for the monitoring of data in terms of disproportionality, and it is there. And so I just, I wanted to ask Dr. McKnight or we board members, is presentation of the disproportionality data part of the equity accountability framework? Because I know at one point we had a presentation and I asked, when does this get presented to the board? And the answer was when the board requests it. And so I just want to make sure that we are reviewing it on a regular basis. And I seem to remember that it was part of our equity framework, but I'm not sure.
Yes, you're talking about the culture part of the equity accountability model that wasn't built out when the model was initially developed. So I think we may have mentioned this in one of our previous board meetings. We will be bringing that back to the board. The team has, aside from COVID-19, come back and say, let's complete building out this discipline. Is a part of that because it speaks to just the culture overall that may exist in the school space and who's impacted and how are they impacted. So yes, that is very much a part of the culture part of that equity accountability model.
So we'll probably see that in the next school year? Jim, you want to speak to that, Mr. DeAndrea?
Two pieces to that, Ms. Silvestre. So we will be sharing some data during the board update around safety, security, and well-being on January 13th, and then updates on the equity accountability model and specifically the development of this new module. Right now, we're scheduled for February 24th. So the updates on the module will be discussed. The data is still being built out there, but January 13th, there will be data that's shared then.
Thank you.
Ms. Silvestri, just to make a connection to a prior discussion, one of the things that we did in the Office of Teaching and Learning in Schools in terms of the creation of the service delivery teams that we talked about at a previous meeting, one was analyzing the disproportionality rates at specific schools and assigning people who had specialties in restorative justice to those particular schools to be part of those teams so that when they were initiated, that expertise was available to them. So it is something that we've been constantly looking at and determining how to best support schools across our 4 offices.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions, comments? No? Well, then as chair of the committee, I'm going to move approval, and no second is needed, but can we take a vote? All in favor? This is to put it up for public comment, just to clarify for everybody.
Favor, raise your hand. And that
And that is unanimous of all those present.
everybody that's here except for Ms. O'Looney, who stepped out a minute.